All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Greetings from a very frigid San Francisco. It seems like we just kind of went right from our late fall warmth right into a winter time very quickly. I am a little bit under the weather as a result. I hope that you all had a great holiday. It actually got me thinking about Durkheim and about the importance of rituals, um, the importance of these kinds of social gatherings, in this case, where we have to think about what we're grateful for and what we're thankful for. I think that's a very important part of being happy in life is, remembering what you're grateful and thankful for. I also think it's easier said than done because a lot of times we're more focused on what we don't have, and we're more focused on taking for granted what we do have. And so these rituals kind of force us to um, reflect and think about how, what we're grateful for. I hope that you were all able to spend, good time with family and loved ones. I know it can also be a stressful time for that reason. So I hope it wasn't too stress inducing and that you did have um, uh, a good time no matter who you were with and under what circumstances. Um, we are heading into the last 2 weeks of this semester, and we're going to spend those last 2 weeks talking about W.E.B. Du Bois. Um, I will reiterate what I've said earlier that Du Bois should really be considered a contemporary, a peer of Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, somebody who was writing during the 1890s and early 1900s in a way that really put sociology on the map in the United States in a similar way that Durkheim did in France and Max Weber did in Germany. Du Bois should really be considered a peer or a contemporary of these folks. And quite often, he is not. Quite often, he is sort of excluded from this theoretical canon. And there are basically historical reasons for why this is, in terms of that we will look at as we get a little bit more into his biography, and sort of what Du Bois was doing in the 1890s and early 1900s in cities like Philadelphia and Atlanta, and how he was basically has been kind of like for a long time was basically like written out of sociology, written out of the history of sociology. Du Bois is a very famous intellectual. I know some of you have already encountered some of his works or his concepts like double consciousness in other classes. Um, but he's often not regarded as a founding father of sociology in the way that Weber and Durkheim are. Um, and the reasons that for that basically boil down to a kind of institutionalized racism. And so in the past few decades, there's been this effort to kind of resuscitate or resurrect Du Bois's legacy and his influence, and to give it a more prominent role in the history of sociology. And so that's what we sort of aim to accomplish. As far as how these next 2 weeks go, I will probably be spending most of this week talking about Du Bois's biography and key concepts, even more so than Weber or Durkheim or even Marx. Weber's or Du Bois's biography, his life story, is essential to his sociology. His experience as a black man in the United States, whose lifespan goes from the end of the Civil War and the emancipation of the enslaved in the 1860s, all the way up until the 1960s, and he dies in 1963 on the night before Martin Luther King delivers his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, D.C. And so that is to say that W.E.B. Du Bois's life kind of spans the history of what we call Jim Crow segregation in America. This form of segregation that was institutionalized after the end of slavery and during the process known as Reconstruction. And that really only came to an end in the 1960s because of the efforts of the civil rights movement, which basically outlawed these more overt forms of discrimination. That's not to say that the civil rights movement cured, America of racism and discrimination, but they did go a long way towards abolishing these more kinds of like legal forms of Jim Crow segregation that were encoded into the law around, the segregation of public facilities, the right to vote, all of that sort of thing. The civil rights movement went a long ways towards ending that system. So Du Bois's life, his biography, kind of spans this period in American history between 1868 when he was born and 1963 when he died. We can go ahead and go into the screen share. I think that covers it with our nuts and bolts for the class, but there is one thing I wanted to add, which is just the remaining assignments that you have for this class basically boil down to two perusal assignments that you have left for Du Bois, but you will also have one last quiz, and that quiz will be the same basic format as the other quizzes that you've taken around Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, or Marx and Durkheim. But this last quiz will be due on the 15th of December, which is when we would be having a final exam. But we are not having a final exam, so the assignment, the quiz, will be due at that time. It'll open up next week on December the 8th, just as the other quizzes have opened up 1 week before they're due. And then you'll have the opportunity to complete that over the course of the last week of class. I hope that clarifies things as far as the way we're headed to the finish line here in our semester. And I will go now to the screen share mode to pull up our perusal assignment and the reading on Du Bois's biography and influences. All right. This quote here that they start with is among them probably the single most famous thing that Du Bois ever said. This was in 1900 when he first said this thing. So he was at the beginning of the 20th century. He was kind of looking forward with his crystal ball, if you will, trying to predict what was going to be, kind of the future of the 20th century. And so he, at this point, says the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And he continues by saying the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea. One important thing I want you to notice about this quote is that he is talking about racism as a global problem, as an international phenomenon, uh, something that obviously he experienced very intensely in America, as we will see in looking at his biography, but also something that he understood was a worldwide problem, a sort of a problem that had been created by centuries of slavery, colonialism, and in his time, imperialism. And that this was something that characterized, again, not just American society, but was an international phenomenon. So Du Bois, more so than Durkheim and Weber, certainly, and even more so than Marx, Du Bois was somebody with an international perspective on society. Um, Whereas Weber and Durkheim were kind of more limited to explaining, I would say, events in Europe. Uh, Du Bois is somebody that always had a kind of a global scope for his thinking. And we will see this in looking at his very first writings, for example, are about the history of the African slave trade. Um, and throughout the course of his life, he continued to have this kind of global perspective. Now, in 1900, this is very important because in 1900, the various European empires are racing to colonize Africa, as well as other parts of the world, right? So the French, France is basically like colonizing parts of like East Africa, and England has colonized, South Africa, Belgium, the Italy has its sort of eyes on Ethiopia. Belgium is colonizing the Congo, um, the Spain, all of these various European empires are competing to take a slice of Africa. They are mostly motivated by its cheap natural resources, oil, palm oil, and rubber, and these kinds of things. Certainly, it's gold and silver, um, and also it's cheap labor. So the European empires are motivated to colonize Africa out of uh, financial as well as military purposes. That is going to lead the world in 1914 into the First World War, a completely catastrophic event in which millions of people die, seemingly for no good reason, other than this kind of competition between the different European empires to, like take over the world. So Du Bois was, in this sense, ahead of his time. He was very much correct to say that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line, that racism, as a justification for colonization and imperialism, would be the thing that would really define the world in the next 100 years going forward. So this gives us a sense of Du Bois's international perspective and his focus on these questions of race, imperialism, colonization, and so forth. So, in the biography that is provided here by the editors, it kind of emphasizes this. And this is, again, something that makes Du Bois distinct from the other sociology founders who we've considered this semester. So, more so than these other social theorists, Du Bois was mainly concerned about the impact of slavery and racism and maintained this kind of international perspective, even when he was looking at racial issues in America. So the biographers or the editors of Du Bois here emphasize this fact that he was the first sociologist to understand that while slavery had existed in other times and places in the world, the transatlantic slave trade was unlike any other form, and participation in the transatlantic slave trade was a foundational event in the history of the United States. Put in another way, 140 years, 140 years before the United States was even a country, it had created a caste system in which Black people were at the bottom with no legal rights. Right? So slavery did not begin with the transatlantic slave trade. You can go back and you can find slavery in all sorts of different societies, including ancient Greece, including ancient Rome. Slavery has, been a sort of a thing in history in all sorts of different societies. But the transatlantic slave trade was on a whole different scale and something that would be, as the editors suggest here, foundational to the history of this country, of this society, and to others around the world, particularly in the West. So for Du Bois, it's crucial to understand how the African slave trade not only impacted American society, but also other societies, certainly Brazil, for example, certainly, much of Latin America and the Caribbean. These were societies that were fundamentally shaped by the transatlantic slave trade, starting in the, early 1600s, even actually before that, as far if you're talking about like the Caribbean, but certainly into the 18th and 19th centuries, that was when the greatest numbers of people, were really, being like kidnapped from mostly from West Africa and being brought across the Atlantic to the United States, but also to Brazil, but also to the Caribbean islands. The transatlantic slave trade was not outlawed in the United States until 1807. So at that point, slavery continued to grow through the natural domestic reproduction of the enslaved population, but it was no longer legal to bring people from Africa. Now, there was still some illegal forms of transatlantic slave trade, but that's another story. Now, Du Bois would have an important influence on the development of American sociology at roughly the same time that Durkheim and Weber did, roughly between the 1890s and the early 1900s. We will see that he learned a lot of his the social scientific methods that he would use were things that he learned in Germany. So we will see that Du Bois, in looking at his biography, he goes off to Harvard, and he's, becomes the first Black American to get a PhD from Harvard. But then he goes off to Germany, where he learns from, among other people, Max Weber, these methods of sociology and social science that he then brings back to America and applies in a whole bunch of studies of the Black community in America. First in Philadelphia, and then later in a whole series of studies where he looks at the Black community in Atlanta. And so he used things like statistics, interviews, surveys, ethnographic observation, all of these methods that are still important in sociology today were really like tried out and developed for the first time in America by Du Bois and by a sort of like a circle of other scholars and sociologists who were around Du Bois. So it was a team effort. It wasn't only Du Bois, but he was certainly, kind of like the coach or the quarterback of that team. So he taught social science methods and conducted scientific research using these techniques that he learned while studying in Germany during the 1890s. And it was here that he would first encounter Max Weber. And Max Weber and W.E.B. Du Bois maintained a friendship for, at least until Weber died in 1920. And Weber actually came to America at one point, and he and Du Bois shared certain kind of intellectual interests. If you'll remember, at the end of our discussion of Max Weber, we talked about his essay on class, status, and party, in which the Max Weber talked about caste, the caste system in which inequality is based on a certain perception of ethnic or racial segregation. That idea was very much influenced by Du Bois's work on understanding the particularities of American racism and ethnic discrimination. So, as a sociologist, Du Bois would utilize these methods and this research to study the Black community in Atlanta and Philadelphia and other cities. However, as this suggests in what the editors have written here, despite his exceptional work and provocative sociological insights, Du Bois was virtually ignored by fellow American sociologists in his day. So, unlike Durkheim and unlike Weber, his work was basically shunned by a large part of the academic world because of racism. And because Du Bois was kind of going against the dominant trend of the time, the dominant trend of the time was to see race as something that was natural or biological, that there were just like different racial groups, and that they had certain, basically that like white Europeans were superior and everybody else was inferior in different ways. And Du Bois's ideas really challenged that. In fact, what Du Bois's life mission in large part was to use scientific methods to refute, to go against this kind of bogus scientific racism that was dominant in his time. And he accomplished a lot in that regard. And yet, because he was kind of going against the tide, because he was, bucking the trend of his time, Du Bois's contributions would not be recognized until much later. And it's like I said, it's really only been in the last couple of decades that sociologists have even begun to consider Du Bois in his rightful place as one of the founders of our discipline. So They were ignored in his time and have really only come to be recognized in hindsight. Um, I highlighted this part about race because, like I said, um, this was something that is more kind of taken for granted in our time, but was certainly not the common wisdom of Du Bois's time. And that is this word race. In our time now, it's pretty well accepted that race does not refer to something that's like inherently biological, but rather it is something that is socially constructed, which is to say that race is a matter of how people are perceived and categorized in society. In Du Bois's time, however, the idea was that race was a matter of biology in which some races were inferior or superior. And that was taken for granted. That was something that was like the common wisdom, if you want to call it that, of the time. There were these kinds of so called scientific racism I mentioned a moment ago. An example of that would be what was called phrenology, that was based on measuring the skulls, the skull size of different racial and ethnic groups, with the idea that somehow you could draw conclusions about the superiority or inferiority of different groups based on how large their skulls were, or how small their skulls were, I suppose. This was, these kinds of like kind of quack scientific racism were very pervasive in the 19th century. They've long since been discredited. They've long been shown to be, I guess, what Marx and Engels would have called ideology. They were forms that sort of masqueraded as science, but in reality, they were just kind of ideological ways of justifying racial inequality, with this kind of veneer that somehow they were scientific. And so, as we'll see, part of Du Bois's life mission was to combat those notions of racism by using the scientific methods of sociology to arrive at a higher truth, which was to say that's, race was something that was socially constructed rather than, simply biological or natural. Um, so that this passage here kind of describes how, at the turn of the 20th century, racism precluded most social scientists from a cogent understanding of race. Indeed, during the 19th and early 20th century, most scientists and essayists writing about so called Negroes denied the very humanity of African Americans. It was widely believed that Negro brains weighed less than those of whites, and that prefrontal deficiencies caused inferior psychic faculties, especially reason, judgment, self control, or voluntary inhibitions. So again, you might think of this as something that is more of more of an ideology than it is a science. Ideology in the sense of ideas that justify inequality and the power of certain groups over other groups. Du Bois, as we will see, comes of age in a time, I mentioned it at the beginning of my remarks, of Jim Crow segregation. So, what you have to understand about Du Bois is that he's born in Massachusetts, in the Northeast, in a relatively like more tolerant and less racist community. It's not that there's no like racism in Massachusetts. It certainly is, but it wasn't nearly as intense as what he would experience when he went to the South. Du Bois comes to the South, I think, in 1885. He's at that point 17 years old. He goes off to college in Nashville, Tennessee. And it's at that time in the 1880s that there is this racist reign of terror that is sweeping through the South that's enforcing this system of Jim Crow segregation. This system of Jim Crow segregation that was basically like a white supremacist counter revolution against the Reconstruction that had followed the Civil War. So it was basically a kind of a rolling back of all of the progress that had been made after slavery was abolished in 1865. And so there had been this period known as Reconstruction where there had been real progress in race, relations or in racial equality. More Black people had the right to vote and held office. There were schools and churches that were built in Black communities across the South. There was real progress in the 1860s and 1870s in regard to this. But in Du Bois's time, he's beginning to see the rollback of this, and it's enforced through this like reign of terror that is symbolized by lynching. So in this period, as it says here, between 1882 and 1901, there were some 150 lynchings every year. And these, and the picture here nicely illustrates that these were ritualized events that often involved an entire community. People would like bring their kids and, pack a picnic lunch or something and attend these horrific events in which people would be hanged from a tree like this, and possibly, tortured or beaten beforehand, or, people would be, burned alive. I mean, just the most horrific kinds of things that you can imagine. And so I posed this question to you. It's kind of a morbid question, but it goes back to our earlier discussion in the class around Durkheim, where Durkheim talked about the ritualized nature of punishment, the way in which punishment is meant to send a message to an entire community, not just to the offender, but to everyone else. Like, if you cross these lines, this is what, sort of will happen to you. And so these lynchings, in many ways, are, kind of like textbook right out of what Durkheim was talking about. That these were forms of public punishment, and violence, in which the intention was to send this sort of message to like the entire Black community. So this was, kind of like how this system of racialized terror, this Jim Crow system, was enforced through violence. As it talks about here in the thing, by the editors, they were communal events with the tacit, if not explicit, support of many quote, upstanding white citizens, including religious clergy. As Du Bois maintained, it was the nucleus of ordinary men that continually gave the mob its initial and awful impetus. So, Du- some of these events have a real major impact on Du Bois. For example, when he is living in Atlanta, he reports one day he's like walking downtown and he passes by a store in which the owners are selling, I believe it was the teeth of somebody who had been lynched. Like they were selling some, if it wasn't the teeth, it was some kind of body part that they were selling this, like in their store. For Du Bois, this is a horrific kind of thing to witness. And yet it was almost mundane or routine in the Jim Crow South, this kind of gruesome violence, this really like kind of over the top sadistic, kind of violence. And, this is not something that Du Bois had encountered in Massachusetts. This is something that was kind of germane to the South at that time. Well, not only to the South. I mean, you look at this picture up here of this lynching, and that's not taking place in the South. That's in Indiana. Um, so, I mean, it was a national kind of phenomenon, but more intensely experienced in the South. Um, so Du Bois has to kind of be seen as a sort of a leader. He is certainly not the only one to be exploring these kinds of issues. There are a number of Black intellectuals of his time who were also leaders in the struggle against racism. So, for example, in this list that's here highlighted, Ida Wells Barnett, Ida B. Wells, was somebody who also like documented a lot of the lynchings that were happening in America. Was an anti-lynching activist and took her own life in her hands, publishing that sort of information in which she was like, documenting all of these lynchings that were happening across America, and was a real kind of trailblazer for civil rights in that regard. Frederick Douglass, obviously, a previous generation. We talked a little bit about Julia Cooper when I talked about Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So, Du Bois was not the only one. Like Du Bois was like part of like this like a generation of Black intellectuals who were, trying to understand, as it says here, to investigate and explain racial issues sociologically, to understand what was happening in America at that time, so that it could be changed. Again, as it says at the bottom of this passage that I've highlighted, he viewed sociological investigation as the solution to racism. So he really thought that sociology had a role to play, not just as a scientific discipline, but as a vehicle of social change. That science and social science could be really useful in combating the ignorance around racism and also changing the society for the better. In that regard, he's kind of like he's more like Marx. Marx always thought of knowledge as a like revolutionary weapon. That you could kind of use in the struggle for justice and equality and freedom. And Du Bois, basically, I think saw things a similar kind of way, as opposed to Durkheim and Weber, who were more inclined to view sociology as a science that should be objective and unbiased and neutral, like a referee in sports. Whereas Du Bois was more kind of activist in his thinking about what sociology could do to combat racism and to sort of try to achieve some kind of racial equality in society. Um, so um, I always have liked this quote from Martin Luther King, who says this right before King himself was assassinated in 1968. But he certainly, Martin Luther King, recognized the genius of Du Bois and his contribution to the struggle for racial equality by saying, Dr. Du Bois was a tireless explorer and a gifted discoverer of social truths. His singular greatness lay in his quest for truth about his own people. His greatest virtue was his committed empathy with all the oppressed and his divine dissatisfaction with all forms of injustice. As I mentioned, Du Bois died in August 1863, the night before King delivered his famous speech at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Um, this passage talks about Anna Julia Cooper. If you'll remember that we talked about Cooper um, in connection with Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Anna Julia Cooper was a Black woman who basically devoted her life to education and taught at a number of Black schools across the country, particularly in Washington, D.C., um, as a high school teacher and also a principal of the school. If you have a U.S. passport, you can look in there and you'll find a quote from Anna Julia Cooper in there. So she is part of this generation of Black women who devoted their lives to education during Reconstruction. When, as I mentioned before, when these Black schools were being constructed across the South in the wake of the Civil War and emancipation, there's like this kind of pent up thirst for education and literacy because enslaved people had been denied education, like forcefully denied education. Um, and, even trying to learn how to read was something that, where you were like taking your life into your hands. The Southern slaveholding class thought it was very important to keep slaves illiterate and ignorant so that they didn't, rebel. And so when the Civil War comes to an end, there's like people want to learn, they want to like learn arithmetic and they want to learn English and they want to learn, how to read and, they want to learn how to write and so forth. And so all these schools start popping up all over the South that are created by Black people. And it's women like Anna Julia Cooper who were really at the forefront of that as educators, as people. And it usually fell to women to do that kind of work in the same way that, like, it's women that do most of the teaching of children to this day. It certainly fell upon Black women in this period in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s to create these schools and to take children under their wing. And so Anna Julia Cooper's work would be very important for, I guess, what we would call um, like an intersectional kind of perspective. We talked about this a little bit with Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Anna Julia Cooper writes this book called A View from the South, which is about basically her experience as a Black woman, and the ways in which like race and class and gender all kind of come together, how they intersect in her life and in her sort of like life story. Um, so Cooper is another one of these parts of this generation. Give me 1 second while I have some water. Okay, much better. There's also this like important debate going on at this time among Black intellectuals about the purpose of education after the Civil War, and it's interesting because it's a debate that we're still having as a society. Like, what should be the point of people going to school, or in particular, like higher education? The people that supported the ideas of Booker T. Washington, who was probably the most famous Black intellectual of the time. Booker T. Washington basically said, like, people should go to school, but only so that they could like learn a job, so that they could learn how to like a trade, or they could like learn how to be a better farmer or something like that. That education for Black people should be like vocational education, that should be basically like a kind of job training, you know. And Du Bois and Anna Julia Cooper and others were vehemently opposed to that. They believed that education should also be a sort of a broad liberal arts kind of education. That people, yeah, they should learn a trade and they should learn how to be a better farmer, but they should also learn like Plato. They should also learn art and philosophy and, the sort of like the liberal arts, the humanities. People should be, should have as much access to a broad education as anybody else. That everybody was entitled to like, learn the sort of like the great ideas and the great arts, and, to learn things, even if they weren't like going to be useful in their job or whatever, even if they weren't going to be like, you know, help you be a better farmer or a better tradesman or a better craftsman. And so Du Bois was very much like in favor of a kind of like a more of a well-rounded liberal arts education. And I think it's interesting that we're still having this kind of debate in our society today, especially like around like the CSU system, or community colleges that serve, more like working class people and more people of color. And the idea is like, well, a lot of people, I think in the CSU chancellor's office, for example, that would like to, basically make the college, higher education in the California state system into a kind of vocational training. The people would just kind of go and they would learn stuff that they need for their job. They would learn how to be better workers in some way, but that they wouldn't like learn all that other stuff like art history and philosophy and social sciences and, all these other kinds of things. And so they're like cutting those programs, they're cutting, arts education, and they're cutting liberal arts, and they're cutting the humanities, and they're kind of destroying these parts of the liberal arts curriculum with the idea of like, well, people don't really need that stuff. They don't really like, what they need is like, I don't know, engineering, or they need, math and science, and they need like, things that'll, like directly relate to some skill that will be useful in the job market. And the rest of us, people like me and, other people's, teachers, we continually advocate for the idea that everyone should have the right to like a broader liberal arts education, that everyone should have time to reflect and learn about things, even if it like doesn't make them into a more productive worker. That education is not just simply a means to getting a job or creating useful workers, that education is a thing, a good thing in and of itself, regardless of whether it pays off or not. And that was the situation that I think that Du Bois sort of found himself at the time. There were a lot of people, at the time who worried that, if people got an education, the way they would put it today is, they were afraid they'd get woke. They were afraid that they would learn about, history and, you know, inequality and oppression and so forth in a way that would like raise their consciousness and make them, I don't know, prone to rebellion or something like that if they really knew the truth. And so they were like, well, the Booker T. Washington people, the people that like supported Booker T. Washington were mostly like white industrialists and farmers and stuff. And they were like, well, what we need to do is like teach people, but only teach people the things that they need, to be better workers. And let's not teach them that whole like kind of history stuff. Let's make them skilled but not woke. Um, Go ahead, Kai.
Yeah, excuse me, I'm also sick, but I was just gonna say too that like as much as like I don't know, like college would be so much easier, right? If I could just like learn what I need to learn and then just call it a day, and then just like you can cut 4 years into 2 years, so it sounds super appealing. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. Like I believe learning a multitude of subjects like makes you think deeply,
Hmm.
about like a variety of different topics. It helps you become like well-rounded intellectually, I think. So
Hmm.
it's incredible. Like I said, it's super appealing to just, go to school for like a year and a half, 2 years or whatever. But at the same time, like as far as like learning and everything like that, I think it's incredibly important, to not just learn, just have everything to be just like cut and dry, but to really like I don't know, like learn like a variety of different subjects as well.
Hmm. Yeah, because it does make a certain amount of sense. Like I sympathize when I have students that are like, yeah, like sure I want to take sociology, but like I need to graduate and like I can't like take out more loans and like like I got to take an efficient path to getting my degree. And I totally understand that. Unfortunately, that's been the situation that has been created with, as tuitions, get higher and people are coming out of college more in debt. It makes sense to just like, focus on the things that you just need in order, to get a degree so that you can get a job, right? Like that's what Max Weber would call instrumental action, instrumental rational action, where you just like take the most efficient path to achieving the goal, the objective. And you don't mess around with all the other stuff. And I understand that, and I also like find it kind of like tragic. I find it like sad because exactly as you're saying, Kai, like the having a sort of a well-rounded, kind of approach, like the whole kind of point of college is to be exposed to like ideas and things that, you when you were in high school, you might not even known that they existed. It's like to broaden your horizons. And it does make you a better person. It does make you a more informed, person. It does make you a more like sensitive and empathetic person, I believe. For all those reasons, I think education is should be seen as a good thing in and of itself, and not just like a path to a good job, you know. And I think it's kind of unfortunate that our society tends to view things the other way. If we've viewed education as a as a thing that was a good in and of itself, we would be better about funding it and making sure that students aren't paying, thousands of dollars in tuition and coming out with a degree, with $50,000 in debt or whatever. We would make it more of a kind of a priority, and that's what we used to do as a society. Like in the 1960s, the CSU system was free. There was no tuition. That's the way it was supposed to be. That was also the case in the UC system. These things were supposed to be tuition free for residents of California, but we've long since abandoned that model of education. And now we're kind of more, our society has kind of gone more into kind of like the Booker T. Washington model, like, education is just like job training. Thank you for your perspective, Kai. I appreciate it, as always. Um, the last thing before we kind of get into the biographical sketch, I wanted to bring up this point about Du Bois's style as a writer. And this is another thing that makes him unique, different from all of the people that we've studied this semester, was that he would include like poetry or song lyrics, like lyrics from like spiritual songs or from the blues. Or he would include his own autobiographical experiences, his own, sort of personal perspective in a way that like Weber did not do, Durkheim did not do, Marx did not do. So he is stylistically very different. And a lot of this kind of tracks back to the fact that Du Bois was influenced by kind of like non-Western forms of knowledge, and challenged, the sort of like the Eurocentric, the European um, styles of thought and writing that were kind of like taken for granted to be the best. And Du Bois was like, well, no, actually, that my style is different. And so he says it here in this paragraph that's quoted here. The style is tropical, African. This needs no apology. The blood of my fathers spoke through me and cast off the English restraint of my training and surroundings. One who is born with a cause is predestined to a certain narrowness of view, and at the same time to some clearness of vision within his limits, with which the world often finds it well to reckon. So here, I mean, this is in 1904. He's not even 30 years old at this point. Oh, I guess he is actually. He would have been like 35. But he's sort of reflecting on his stylistic choices. And I like that sentence that says, the blood of my father spoke through me and cast off the English restraint of my training and surroundings. Like his like ancestors, are kind of like, speaking through him, I suppose he would say. in this instance, not like literally, but figuratively in the way that he inherited this unique style of writing that was very unlike what his European peers of the time were doing. Um, and so that sort of describes the uniqueness of his style. The last thing I wanted to emphasize before we cut out for the day is to circle back to Du Bois's contributions to sociology. And this, like I said, it's only been in the last couple of decades that people have begun to recognize the importance role that Du Bois played. One of a number of scholars who have like kind of uncovered Du Bois's influence in sociology is this guy Lawrence Bobo, who is a professor at Harvard. He holds a position that is named after Du Bois himself. He's a social scientist. And Bobo writes, were it not for the deeply entrenched racism in the United States during his early professional years, Du Bois would be recognized alongside the likes of Albion Small, Edward A. Ross, Robert E. Park, Lewis Worth, and W.I. Thomas as one of the fountainheads of American sociology. Had not racism so thoroughly excluded him from placement in the center of the academy, he might arguably have come to rank with Max Weber or Emil Durkheim in stature. So those people that he lists here, Small, Ross, Park, Worth, Thomas, these are scholars that are associated with the Chicago School of Sociology. And generally in any textbook, if you look at like the how a standard kind of like textbook lays out the history of sociology, they usually begin with the Chicago School. These were scholars, in the 19 teens and 1920s who did a lot of work in the city of Chicago to understand, everything from immigration to crime to poverty to, urban neighborhoods and all this sort of thing. The thing is that Du Bois and his peers were actually doing that earlier in Atlanta. Du Bois, as we will see when we look at his biography in more depth in the next class, Du Bois came to Atlanta in, I think, 1897 after he had returned from Germany. And he surrounds himself with a number of other Black scholars who want to use the social sciences for the same purposes that Du Bois does to combat racism and to try to change the society by understanding its dynamics. And so Du Bois will spend the next 13 years between 1897 and 1910 working with these group of Black intellectuals at a historically Black college that's called today it's called Clark Atlanta University. Then it was just Atlanta University. But they're basically looking at the dynamics of the Black community in Atlanta during this period before the Chicago School, before this other generation that is listed here. And so they really should be considered the kind of the forerunners of this kind of approach to what today would be called like urban sociology, the study of crime and gangs and poverty and employment and a whole range of issues that are germane to cities. So a kind of urban sociology. So Du Bois really should be given his, what do they say today? Like given his flowers. Du Bois is only now being given his flowers. for being recognized uh, for his contributions in a way that should have been done long ago. And that's what we're going to talk about next time. We'll sort of look at like how Du Bois has a really interesting story where he like goes off to Germany and he learns all these kind of social scientific methods and he brings them back to America, for the purpose of doing these studies. And it's a really inspiring kind of thing that makes you sort of proud to be a sociologist, to be like, oh, that's what sociology at its best is. And so I personally find the example that Du Bois set to be very inspiring. That'll pretty much do it for today. I hope that, like I said, you all had a great time, and I wish you the best. And I'll see you all on Wednesday. Okay, bye.